The clock strikes midnight on December 31st, 1999. In bunkers across America, families huddle around battery-powered radios, waiting. In Moscow, technicians hover over nuclear command systems, watching for the glitch that could trigger Armageddon. In churches worldwide, congregations pray through the final hours, some convinced they'll be raptured before dawn, others certain that computer failures will collapse civilization by sunrise. The ball drops in Times Square, the crowd erupts in celebration, and nothing happens. The lights stay on, the banks still function. The world keeps turning. Humanity's latest predicted ending passes quietly into history, joining countless others in our species' long, strange relationship with apocalypse. Did you know that there have been at least 200 documented predictions for the end of the world just in the past 2 centuries? Or that the word apocalypse originally meant unveiling or revelation rather than destruction? Tonight on Midnight Deep Dive, we're exploring humanity's enduring fascination with endings, from ancient flood myths to modern AI extinction scenarios, from medieval millennial panics to the rapture culture that shapes American Christianity. We'll discover why every generation seems to believe they're living in the end times, how our apocalyptic visions reflect our deepest fears and values, and what our endless predictions of doom reveal about the human need for meaning and transformation. So settle in, get comfy, and let yourself drift peacefully as we uncover the surprising and fascinating story of how humanity has imagined its own ending across the ages. Long before we had words like apocalypse or Armageddon, our ancestors understood endings. They watched the sun disappear each evening, wondering if it would return. They survived floods that swallowed entire valleys, droughts that emptied rivers, and earthquakes that reshaped landscapes overnight. In a world where nature's power could erase everything familiar in moments, the idea that the whole world might end didn't seem far-fetched. It seemed inevitable. The ancient Mesopotamians, who gave us some of humanity's earliest written records, preserved a story that would echo through millennia. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, written nearly 4,000 years ago, we find Utnapishtim, a man warned by the gods of a coming flood that would destroy all life on Earth. He builds a great boat, gathers his family and animals, and survives while the world drowns beneath waters that rise for 6 days and nights. Sound familiar? This story predates the biblical flood narrative by more than 1,000 years, and similar flood myths appear in cultures across the globe, from ancient Greece to indigenous Australia to pre-Columbian Americas. What's remarkable isn't just that these stories exist, but that they're so eerily similar despite arising in cultures that had no contact with each other. Scholars debate whether these myths preserve actual memories of catastrophic local floods, perhaps the rapid filling of the Black Sea around 560 BCE, or whether they represent something deeper in human psychology. The flood as ultimate ending makes intuitive sense. Water, the source of life, becomes the agent of death. The world doesn't burn or shatter, it returns to the primordial chaos from which creation first emerged. The ancient Hindus conceived of time in vast cycles that make our modern apocalyptic timelines seem quaint by comparison. They envisioned existence as an endless wheel of creation and dissolution, with each cycle lasting 4.32 billion years, a number that eerily approximates the actual age of Earth discovered by modern geology. We currently live, according to Hindu cosmology, in the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and discord, the final quarter of the cosmic cycle before dissolution and rebirth. This isn't a one-time ending, but an eternal pattern, like the universe breathing in and out across timescales that dwarf human comprehension. What's beautiful about this cyclical view is its essential optimism. Endings aren't final, they're transitions. The god Shiva performs his cosmic dance, destroying the universe so that Brahma can create it anew. Death and rebirth are partners in an eternal rhythm, neither good nor evil, simply the nature of existence itself. This perspective offered ancient peoples a way to accept catastrophe without despair. to see endings as natural and even necessary phases in an endless process. The Norse peoples of Scandinavia told stories around winter fires about Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods, a final battle that would consume gods and men alike. The great wolf Fenrir would break his chains, the world's serpent Jörmungandr would rise from the ocean, and fire giant Surtur would set the world ablaze. The gods themselves would fall in battle. Yet even in this brutal ending, the Norse sagas speak of survivors, of a new green earth rising from the sea, of a future where the children of the gods would rule over a renewed world. These weren't just entertaining stories. They were frameworks for understanding trauma, loss, and change. When harsh winters killed crops and starvation threatened, when raids destroyed villages, when disease swept through communities, these apocalyptic narratives provided context. The world had ended before and would end again, yet existence continued. There was comfort in this cosmic perspective, even when the specific prophecies were terrifying. The ancient Greeks and Romans personified apocalyptic thinking in their own ways. Hesiod's Works and Days, written around 700 BCE, described 5 ages of humanity, each worse than the last, with the current Iron Age destined to end when Zeus would finally destroy our wicked generation. The Romans consulted the Sibylline books, mysterious prophetic texts that supposedly predicted the fate of their civilization, and advised them on how to avert cosmic disaster through proper rituals and sacrifices. What united all these ancient apocalyptic visions was their connection to moral order. Endings came because humanity had violated sacred laws, angered the gods, or fallen into corruption. The flood came because humanity had become wicked. Ragnarök would arrive after a period of moral decay when brother will fight brother, and an axe age, a sword age, would precede the final battle. The world's ending was always deserved, always a cosmic response to human failing. This meant that apocalypse was simultaneously terrifying and comprehensible, both punishment and, in a strange way, justice. The ancient Jewish prophetic tradition added new dimensions to apocalyptic thinking. The Hebrew Bible's prophets spoke of a day of the Lord, when God would judge nations and establish divine justice. But these prophecies served immediate political and social purposes, warning communities about the consequences of injustice and idolatry. The apocalyptic literature that emerged during the Babylonian exile and later periods, like the Book of Daniel, depicted cosmic battles between good and evil, divine intervention in history, and the eventual triumph of God's kingdom. This tradition introduced something revolutionary: the idea that apocalypse wasn't just about endings, but about radical transformation and ultimate justice. The world would end, yes, but what came after would be fundamentally better. This was apocalypse as hope rather than despair, ending as gateway to redemption. This concept would profoundly influence later Christian and Islamic eschatology, creating apocalyptic visions that combine destruction with salvation, terror with promise. The ancient Mayans developed sophisticated astronomical observations and mathematical systems that tracked vast cycles of time. Their long count calendar measured periods of 5125 years, with one such cycle ending on December 21, 2012, a date that would later inspire modern apocalyptic anxiety despite zero evidence that the Mayans themselves viewed it as predicting the world's end. They saw time as cyclical, with each cycle bringing renewal rather than termination. What's fascinating is how these ancient peoples used apocalyptic thinking practically. Astronomical observations that might predict eclipses or comets became signs of cosmic displeasure. Natural disasters were interpreted through apocalyptic frameworks. This wasn't primitive superstition, but sophisticated meaning-making, a way of understanding catastrophe that preserved social order and provided guidance for action. When the Nile failed to flood, Egyptian priests consulted prophecies and prescribed rituals. When earthquakes struck Greek cities, oracles explained them as divine warnings. The ancient world understood something we often forget: endings are part of the natural order. Civilizations rose and fell. Empires collapsed. Cities were abandoned to the desert. Yet people survived, adapted, and rebuilt. The apocalyptic imagination wasn't about predicting a literal final day, but about processing the very real endings that punctuated human experience, about finding meaning in disaster, and about maintaining hope that whatever came after might be better than what came before. As the year 999 turned toward 1000 CE, something remarkable happened across Christian Europe. Or rather, popular imagination insists something remarkable happened, though historians now debate the extent of the panic. The story we've inherited speaks of mass hysteria, of peasants abandoning their fields and nobles giving away their wealth, of crowds gathering in churches to await Christ's return at the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve. The reality was likely more complex, but the legend itself reveals something profound about how medieval people processed time, fear, and faith. The concept of millennialism, the belief that the year 1000 would bring the second coming and final judgment, emerged from a reading of Revelation chapter 20, which speaks of Christ reigning for 1,000 years before Satan's final defeat. Medieval Europeans lived in a world where biblical prophecy wasn't metaphor, but literal roadmap. If Christ had been born around year 0, a dating system only established centuries later, then the year 1000 represented a cosmic threshold, a moment when earthly time would give way to eternal judgment. What we know for certain is that apocalyptic anxiety permeated medieval culture, particularly in the decades leading up to the millennium. Chronicles from the period describe unusual celestial phenomena, comets, eclipses, and auroras interpreted as signs of approaching doom. A comet in 989 CE caused widespread terror. A solar eclipse in 990 triggered mass prayers and penitential processions. When a plague of ergotism, caused by contaminated grain, struck in the 990s, causing hallucinations and convulsions, many saw it as a plague heralding the end times. The medieval worldview made apocalyptic thinking almost inevitable. Life was short, often brutal, and pervaded by suffering. Infant mortality claimed half of all children before age 5. Famine came with failed harvests. Disease swept through communities without warning or remedy. Violence from warfare, raiding, and local conflicts was endemic. In this context, the promise of divine intervention and final justice wasn't just comfort. It was rational hope that the world's suffering had meaning and would eventually end. Churches and monasteries became centers of millennial speculation. Monks pored over biblical texts, searching for signs and dates. The Book of Revelation, with its vivid imagery of beasts, dragons, seals, and trumpets, became a kind of code to be deciphered. The Antichrist was expected any day. The 4 horsemen would surely ride soon. The faithful prepared their souls, while scholars tried to calculate the precise moment when earthly time would end. When midnight passed on December 31, 999, and the world continued, the response wasn't collective disappointment, but rather a kind of religious renewal. Many historians argue that the apocalyptic tension of the millennium period actually energized medieval Christianity, leading to the Peace of God movement, increased church building, the great Romanesque cathedrals, and a general sense that humanity had been granted additional time to prepare for inevitable judgment. But millennial anxiety didn't end with the year 1000. Some theologians argued that the millennium should be calculated from Christ's death rather than his birth, pushing the critical date to 1033. When that year also passed without apocalypse, interpretations shifted again. Perhaps the millennium was metaphorical, perhaps the calculations were off, perhaps the signs hadn't all appeared yet. Apocalyptic thinking proved remarkably adaptable, capable of surviving any number of failed predictions. The medieval period brought new apocalyptic catalysts. The arrival of Islam and rapid Muslim expansion in the 7th and 8th centuries struck Christian Europe as an apocalyptic event itself. Could Mohammed be the Antichrist? Were the Muslim conquests the beginnings of end times tribulation? The Crusades were motivated partly by apocalyptic theology, with many believing that recapturing Jerusalem was necessary before Christ could return. Then came the Black Death, arriving in Europe in 1347 and killing between 1/3 and 1/2 of the continent's population within 5 years. If anything deserved the label apocalypse, this was it. Entire villages were emptied, cities lost the majority of their inhabitants, the social order collapsed, trade networks fell apart, agricultural production plummeted. The church couldn't explain why God allowed such suffering, and faith itself was shaken. The plague years saw apocalyptic fervor reach fever pitch. Flagellant movements emerged, with groups of penitents traveling from town to town, whipping themselves bloody to appease God's wrath. Jews were scapegoated and massacred in one of history's most horrific episodes of apocalyptic scapegoating. Prophets appeared claiming special knowledge of God's plans. Art from the period shows an obsession with death, judgment, and damnation, with Dance of Death imagery showing skeletons leading people of all social classes to their doom. What's remarkable is that medieval apocalyptic thinking, for all its terror, maintained certain boundaries. The actual date of the end times was considered unknowable, based on Christ's teaching that no one knows the day or hour. This meant that while signs could be read and general timelines proposed, specific date setting was theologically suspect. This didn't stop people from trying, but it did create a framework where failed predictions could be absorbed, without completely destroying the apocalyptic worldview. The medieval Italian monk Joachim of Fiore developed an influential apocalyptic theology in the late 12th century, proposing that history unfolded in 3 ages corresponding to the Trinity: the age of the Father, Old Testament law; the age of the Son, Christian Church; and a coming age of the Holy Spirit characterized by spiritual freedom and monastic contemplation. His predictions of this transition occurring around 1260 inspired movements for centuries, influencing everyone from Franciscan radicals to Reformation theologians. Medieval apocalypticism wasn't just about endings, it was about justice and inversion of worldly hierarchies. The meek would inherit the earth, the rich would face judgment for their wealth, the powerful would be cast down, the suffering would be vindicated. This apocalyptic hope sustained the poor and powerless through difficult lives, offering assurance that current inequalities were temporary and that divine justice would eventually prevail. The printing press's invention in the 15th century would democratize apocalyptic speculation in ways medieval scholars couldn't have imagined. Prophetic texts, previously confined to monastery libraries, could now circulate widely. Illustrated apocalypses brought Revelation's vivid imagery to mass audiences. The Reformation would unleash new waves of apocalyptic interpretation as Protestants and Catholics accused each other of being agents of Antichrist. Medieval people lived with one foot in the earthly world and one in the cosmic drama of salvation and damnation. Their apocalyptic thinking wasn't an irrational quirk, but a sophisticated theological framework for understanding suffering, hoping for justice, and maintaining faith through centuries of genuine hardship. When the world felt like it was ending, which it did with alarming regularity, apocalyptic narratives provided both explanation and comfort. The end was coming, yes, but it would bring judgment, justice, and for the faithful, eternal reward. In 1830, a 15-year-old Scottish girl named Margaret MacDonald experienced a religious vision. Sick with fever in Port Glasgow, she reported seeing 2 stages to Christ's return. First, a secret coming to gather believers, then a visible return to judge the world. This vision, dismissed by most of her contemporaries, would eventually reshape American Christianity and create one of modern culture's most pervasive apocalyptic narratives. The doctrine of the rapture, now so familiar it seems ancient, was actually born in the parlors and prayer meetings of 19th century Britain before crossing the Atlantic and becoming distinctly American. John Nelson Darby, an Anglo-Irish evangelist and founder of the Plymouth Brethren movement, took MacDonald's vision and systematized it into a comprehensive theology called dispensationalism. Darby's innovation was brilliantly simple. He divided all of history into distinct ages or dispensations, with humanity currently living in the church age. This age would end abruptly when Christ secretly returned to rapture true believers into heaven, sparing them from 7 years of tribulation before his glorious second coming. This pre-tribulation rapture theology was revolutionary, offering believers escape rather than endurance. The concept spread slowly at first, confined mainly to small evangelical circles. But in 1909, Cyrus Scofield published his reference Bible, which embedded dispensationalist interpretations directly into the biblical text through extensive footnotes. The Scofield Bible became immensely popular in American fundamentalist circles, treating Darby's relatively new theology as if it were ancient biblical truth. Sunday school teachers, pastors, and missionaries trained on the Scofield Bible carried rapture theology to millions of American Christians, who came to accept it as traditional doctrine rather than recent innovation. What made the rapture such a compelling narrative? First, it offered certainty in uncertain times. The early 20th century brought world wars, economic depression, and social upheaval. The rapture provided a roadmap, transforming chaos into prophetic fulfillment. Every disaster could be interpreted as a sign of the times. Second, it offered escape. Unlike earlier apocalyptic theologies that emphasized Christians enduring tribulation, the rapture promised believers they'd be whisked away before things got really bad. This was apocalypse with a divine evacuation plan. The Cold War supercharged rapture theology. Nuclear weapons made global destruction suddenly plausible. The founding of Israel in 1948 seemed to fulfill biblical prophecies about Jewish return to their homeland. The Soviet Union became the perfect candidate for Revelation's end times villain. Hal Lindsey's 1970 book, The Late Great Planet Earth, sold over 35 million copies by weaving current events into dispensationalist prophecy, arguing that all signs pointed to the rapture occurring within a generation of 1948, meaning by the 1980s or 1990s at latest. Christian bookstores filled with rapture novels, prophecy guides, and charts mapping current events onto biblical prophecy. Children in evangelical churches grew up terrified they might return from school to find their parents vanished. The anxiety was real and often traumatic. Former evangelical adults described childhood panic attacks when they couldn't immediately find their parents, convinced the rapture had occurred and they'd been left behind. The 1990s saw rapture culture reach peak cultural influence with the Left Behind series by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins. These novels, which sold over 65 million copies, dramatized the rapture and subsequent tribulation as action thriller entertainment. Airline pilots disappeared mid-flight. Cars crashed as drivers vanished. The books depicted a world descending into chaos as those left behind realized they'd missed their chance at salvation. The series spawned movies, video games, and even a children's book series, embedding rapture theology deep into American popular culture. But rapture belief has had consequences beyond entertainment. It has influenced American foreign policy, particularly regarding Israel and the Middle East. Many evangelical leaders supported aggressive Israeli expansion and even opposed Middle East peace efforts, believing that conflict in the region was prophetically necessary. When you believe the world must get worse before it gets better, and that attempting to prevent prophesied events is futile or even contrary to God's will, political decision-making shifts dramatically. Environmental policy has been similarly affected. Why worry about climate change if you believe Jesus is returning imminently to establish a new heaven and new earth? Former Secretary of the Interior James Watt famously testified before Congress that he didn't know how many future generations we can count on before the Lord returns, suggesting environmental stewardship was less urgent given rapture expectations. While not all rapture believers share this view, the theology can create a framework where long-term planetary health seems less important than readiness for imminent divine intervention. The psychology of living in expectation of the rapture creates unique cognitive patterns. Believers become hypervigilant for signs, interpreting natural disasters, political events, technological developments, and cultural changes through prophetic lenses. Blood moons, rare astronomical alignments, and solar eclipses trigger waves of speculation on social media and in evangelical circles. Each generation finds reasons to believe they're living in the final days, from 1980s nuclear fears to IT-1000 anxieties, to current concerns about artificial intelligence, digital currency, and microchips as potential mark of the beast. Failed predictions haven't dampened enthusiasm. Harold Camping, a Christian radio broadcaster, famously predicted the rapture would occur on May 21, 2011. When nothing happened, he revised his prediction to October 21, 2011. Some followers quit their jobs and spent their life savings on billboard advertisements warning of the coming judgment. The psychological aftermath was devastating for many. But Camping's failures were just the latest in a long history of specific date setting that evangelical leaders officially discourage, while practically encouraging through constant signs interpretation. The internet age has created new forms of rapture speculation. YouTube channels rack up millions of views with videos connecting current events to biblical prophecy. Facebook groups share memes about rapture readiness. Twitter threads analyze news stories for prophetic significance. The medium has changed, but the underlying psychology remains. The desire to believe you're living through history's most important moment, that your generation is special, that you possess secret knowledge about how the world will end. What's fascinating is how rapture culture has influenced secular conspiracy theories. QAnon, with its promise of a great awakening, when truth would be revealed and evil punished, mirrors rapture theology structure. Replace rapture with the storm and divine judgment with military tribunals, and the narrative frameworks are remarkably similar. Both offer believers insider status, interpret current events as cosmic battles between good and evil, and promise imminent dramatic transformation where the faithful are vindicated and enemies destroyed. For children raised in rapture-focused communities, the psychological impact can be profound. Imagine growing up believing the world could end at any moment, that most of humanity was headed for eternal torture, that your unsaved friends and family would face 7 years of unimaginable tribulation if they didn't convert. Many former evangelicals described the trauma of this worldview, the anxiety it produced, and the difficulty of reconstructing meaning and purpose after leaving the faith. Yet for millions of Americans, rapture belief provides genuine comfort. It offers assurance that suffering has meaning, that justice will prevail, that faithfulness will be rewarded. It creates community among those who share this framework for understanding reality. It provides clear moral boundaries and a sense of purpose. The appeal isn't mysterious. It's the same appeal that apocalyptic thinking has always offered: certainty in uncertain times, meaning in chaos, and hope that current suffering will end in ultimate vindication. The rapture is now so embedded in American evangelical culture that many believers assume it's biblical doctrine dating back to the early church, unaware that it's a relatively recent theological innovation. This demonstrates something profound about how religious beliefs evolve and how new ideas can become traditional within just a few generations. The rapture may have started with a Scottish girl's fever dream, but it became a defining feature of American Christianity, shaping politics, culture, and millions of individual lives in ways its originators never could have imagined. The early scientists who first calculated the age of the Earth faced an unsettling realization. If the planet had a beginning, it must also have an ending. In the 19th century, as physicists began understanding thermodynamics and entropy, they arrived at a disturbing conclusion known as heat death. Lord Kelvin calculated that the sun must eventually exhaust its fuel and grow cold. Without solar warmth, Earth would freeze into a lifeless ball of ice. For the first time, apocalypse wasn't a matter of divine judgment or mythological catastrophe, but scientific certainty. The universe itself was slowly running down like a cosmic clock, and nothing could stop it. This represented a profound shift in how educated people thought about endings. Religious apocalypse promised judgment followed by renewal. The heat death of the universe offered only cold, dark, eternal silence. Victorian-era thinkers grappled with the philosophical implications. If everything was destined for thermodynamic equilibrium, did anything ultimately matter? The poet Algernon Swinburne captured this bleak vision in verse about a dying sun and freezing earth. Scientists reassured the public that this heat death lay billions of years in the future. But the knowledge that it was coming fundamentally altered humanity's cosmic perspective. The discovery of deep time similarly revolutionized apocalyptic thinking. Geologists examining rock layers and fossils realized Earth was not thousands, but millions, later billions, of years old. This meant humanity existed for only a brief flash in planetary history. Paleontologists discovering extinct species like dinosaurs revealed that Earth had experienced multiple apocalypses, mass extinctions that wiped out dominant life forms and reset evolution's course. The planet's history was written in catastrophe, and there was no reason to think such catastrophes had ended. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution added another unsettling dimension. Species weren't permanent divine creations, but temporary adaptations subject to extinction when environments changed. Humans, far from being the eternal pinnacle of creation, were just another species in the endless churn of natural selection. Future species would replace us just as we had replaced earlier hominids. This wasn't apocalypse as singular event, but as natural process. The normal turnover of life on a planet that cared nothing for any particular species. The late 19th and early 20th centuries brought new scientific apocalypse scenarios. Astronomers discovered that stars could explode as supernovae. Could our sun do the same? Probably not, they reassured, but other stars certainly could, and if one exploded nearby, Earth would be sterilized by radiation. Geologists warned of supervolcanoes like the one beneath Yellowstone that had caused previous mass extinctions and could erupt again. Biologists warned that new diseases could emerge that medical science couldn't contain. The discovery of radioactivity opened frightening new possibilities. Pierre and Marie Curie's work revealed unstable elements that spontaneously released enormous energy. Science fiction writers immediately imagined weapons harnessing atomic power. But most physicists assured the public that releasing atomic energy in a controlled explosion was probably impossible. Then, on August 6, 1945, Hiroshima burned under an atomic fireball, and humanity suddenly possessed the ability to end civilization through its own actions, rather than waiting for cosmic catastrophe. The atomic scientists who created the bomb were among the first to recognize what they'd unleashed. J. Robert Oppenheimer, watching the first nuclear test, recalled a line from Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Many Manhattan Project physicists spent the rest of their lives advocating for nuclear disarmament, haunted by their role in creating the ultimate doomsday weapon. They'd handed humanity the power to create its own apocalypse, and that power couldn't be uninvented. The Cold War transformed scientific apocalypse from distant theoretical concern to imminent existential threat. The United States and Soviet Union built arsenals capable of destroying human civilization multiple times over. Nuclear strategists calculated scenarios where a single miscommunication or technical error could trigger global annihilation within hours. The concept of mutually assured destruction turned apocalypse into deliberate policy, a threat both sides maintained to prevent either from attacking. Scientists created the Doomsday clock in 1947 as a symbol of how close humanity stood to self-inflicted apocalypse. Initially set at 7 minutes to midnight, it has moved closer and farther from doom based on nuclear threats, climate change, and other existential risks. At its most threatening in 1953 and again in 2018-2020, it stood at 2 minutes to midnight, closer to symbolic apocalypse than at any other time except 2023, when it was set to 90 seconds to midnight, the closest ever. The 1980s brought nuclear anxiety to peak intensity. Films like The Day After and Threads showed audiences what nuclear war would actually mean. Instant vaporization for those near blast sites, slower death from radiation for those farther away, nuclear winter potentially ending all agriculture and starving survivors. These weren't sensationalized scenarios, but careful extrapolations from scientific understanding. The message was clear. Nuclear war wouldn't have winners, only varying degrees of loss. Carl Sagan and other scientists researched nuclear winter, discovering that the smoke and dust from burning cities would block sunlight, dropping global temperatures and potentially triggering an extinction event. Even a limited nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan, some studies suggested, could destabilize global climate and cause mass famine. The nuclear threat wasn't just about immediate blast damage, but about cascade effects that could unravel the environmental systems that supported human civilization. As the Cold War ended, scientific attention shifted to other apocalyptic threats. Climate scientists warned that fossil fuel emissions were warming the planet, potentially triggering feedback loops that could make Earth uninhabitable. Unlike sudden nuclear apocalypse, climate change threatened slow-motion catastrophe. Rising seas, mass migration, resource wars, ecosystem collapse. This gradualism made it psychologically harder to grasp, even as the scientific evidence grew overwhelming. The late 20th and early 21st centuries brought new scientific apocalypse scenarios. Asteroid detection programs revealed how many near-Earth objects posed collision risks. Just one large asteroid impact could cause a mass extinction like the one that killed the dinosaurs. Particle physics experiments briefly sparked fears that new colliders might create black holes or strange matter that would consume Earth. Genetic engineering and synthetic biology raised concerns about engineered pathogens or ecological disasters from modified organisms. Artificial intelligence emerged as an apocalyptic concern as computers grew more powerful. Early AI researchers like Marvin Minsky and later scientists like Nick Bostrom warned that advanced AI might pose existential risks if its goals weren't perfectly aligned with human values. The control problem became a serious field of research. How do you ensure that superintelligent AI doesn't accidentally or deliberately destroy humanity while pursuing whatever objectives it's been given? What makes scientific apocalypse particularly unsettling is its inevitability and indifference. The universe doesn't care about human survival. Asteroids follow orbital mechanics without concern for what they hit. Climate systems respond to forcing factors regardless of the civilizations affected. Artificial intelligence, if created, would pursue its programmed goals without inherent regard for human welfare. Scientific apocalypse strips away the moral framework that made religious apocalypse comprehensible as punishment or testing, replacing it with cold physics and probability. Yet scientific thinking also offered hope that religious apocalypse never could: prevention. You can't prevent divine judgment if God has decided it's time, but you can potentially deflect asteroids, reduce emissions, manage AI development, and prepare for pandemics. Scientific apocalypse was terrifying precisely because it was real, but it was also empowering because human action could potentially prevent or mitigate these threats. This tension between danger and agency defines our current relationship with apocalyptic thinking. The scientific worldview transformed apocalypse from certainty to risk management. We're not waiting for an inevitable ending, but navigating a probability space of various existential threats, each with different timelines, likelihood, and potential interventions. This is less emotionally satisfying than traditional apocalypse narratives, but more aligned with reality. The world won't end because we deserve it or because prophecy demands it, but it might end if we don't take certain preventable threats seriously enough. Picture this: it's October 27, 1962, and a Soviet submarine lies deep beneath the Caribbean Sea, hunted by American destroyers. The submarine's batteries are dying, the air is foul, and the captain doesn't know that nuclear war hasn't already begun. He has authorization to launch his nuclear torpedo. 2 officers agree. Only Vasily Arkhipov, the second in command, refuses. His solitary descent prevents the launch and arguably saves the world. Most people alive today owe their existence to one Russian officer's restraint during the Cuban Missile Crisis. A 13-day period when humanity stood closer to nuclear apocalypse than at any other time in history. The nuclear age began not with political decision, but scientific discovery. In 1938, German scientists discovered nuclear fission. Splitting uranium atoms released tremendous energy. Within 7 years, this laboratory curiosity became the most destructive weapons ever created. The Manhattan Project brought together the finest scientific minds to build atomic bombs, driven by fears that Nazi Germany would develop them first. The scientists succeeded beyond their darkest expectations, creating weapons that could destroy entire cities in single blasts. When Little Boy detonated over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, it released energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT, killing 80,000 people instantly, and tens of thousands more from radiation sickness in the following months. 3 days later, Fat Man destroyed Nagasaki. The world had entered a new era where apocalypse was no longer theoretical or distant, but demonstrated and available. Humanity now possessed the power to end itself, and that power resided in weapons that could be delivered by aircraft anywhere on Earth. The scientists who created these weapons were among the first to grasp the implications. Many became advocates for international control of atomic energy, and when that failed, for nuclear disarmament. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists created the Doomsday Clock in 1947 to represent how close humanity stood to self-annihilation. They set it initially at 7 minutes to midnight, a metaphor that proved enduring precisely because it captured something essential about the nuclear age. We were all living on borrowed time, gambling that the weapons wouldn't be used before we found a way to eliminate them. The Cold War transformed nuclear apocalypse from possibility to likelihood in the minds of many. The United States and Soviet Union, former allies against fascism, became locked in ideological conflict, where each side saw the other as existential threat. Both nations built ever larger nuclear arsenals, developing not just atomic bombs, but thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs, thousands of times more powerful. By the 1960s, both superpowers possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other's societies many times over. The strategy became known as Mutually Assured Destruction, MAD, an acronym that captured the insanity of the situation. Peace depended on both sides believing that launching nuclear weapons would guarantee their own destruction, making attack suicidal. This balance of terror was supposed to prevent war, but it also meant that any miscalculation, any technical failure, any misinterpreted radar signal could trigger apocalypse. The world's fate rested on the assumption that all actors would always behave rationally. Civil defense efforts tried to make nuclear war survivable. Governments built fallout shelters, ran public drills, and distributed information about protecting yourself during atomic attack. The infamous duck and cover campaigns taught schoolchildren to hide under desks if they saw a nuclear flash, as if wooden furniture could protect against weapons that vaporized buildings. These efforts were partly genuine preparation, but also psychological management, giving people something to do rather than simply waiting helplessly for potential annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 brought the world to the brink. When American reconnaissance discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, President Kennedy demanded their removal and established a naval blockade. For 13 days, the world held its breath while the two superpowers engaged in a deadly game of brinkmanship. We now know how close we came to catastrophe. Submarines armed with nuclear torpedoes, authorization protocols nearly triggered multiple near-miss incidents that could have spiraled into global war. Only through back-channel diplomacy, Soviet restraint, and sheer luck did both sides step back from the abyss. The crisis changed how people thought about nuclear war. It was no longer an abstract future threat, but something that had nearly happened that could happen again tomorrow. Cultural products reflected this anxiety. Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, 1964, used dark comedy to mock the absurdity of nuclear strategy. Showing military leaders and politicians stumbling into apocalypse through combination of incompetence, ideology, and technology beyond their control. The film's subtitle, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, captured the gallows humor of living under permanent nuclear threat. Throughout the Cold War, multiple close calls occurred that the public only learned about years later. In 1979, NORAD's computers indicated a massive Soviet nuclear strike was incoming. Officers prepared retaliatory launch before discovering it was a technical error. In 1983, Soviet early warning systems detected what appeared to be American missile launches. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, suspecting a false alarm, refused to report it as an attack, preventing potential Soviet retaliation. In 1995, a Norwegian research rocket was misidentified as a potential nuclear missile, and Russian President Boris Yeltsin became the first world leader to activate the nuclear briefcase before determining it wasn't an attack. These incidents revealed uncomfortable truth. The systems designed to prevent accidental nuclear war were fallible, dependent on individual human judgment during moments of extreme stress and time pressure. We survived the Cold War not just because of deterrence theory, but because specific individuals, often whose names we'll never know, made correct decisions during critical minutes when wrong choices would have triggered apocalypse. The nuclear anxiety of the 1980s reached peak intensity. President Reagan's Star Wars missile defense initiative and rhetoric about the Soviet Union as an evil empire reignited fears that had somewhat subsided during détente. Television movies like The Day After 1983 and British film Threads 1984 depicted nuclear war's aftermath in horrifying detail, showing not just immediate destruction, but weeks and months of suffering afterward. Radiation sickness, starvation, societal collapse, nuclear winter potentially ending agriculture and causing mass extinction. Carl Sagan and other scientists worked to communicate nuclear winter theory to the public. They explained that smoke and dust from burning cities would block sunlight, potentially dropping global temperatures by 20-30 degrees Celsius and creating conditions that could end human civilization even without direct nuclear blast effects. This meant that even winners of nuclear war would face catastrophic consequences, adding another layer to the mutual assured destruction equation. Children growing up during the Cold War lived with nuclear apocalypse as ever-present background anxiety. School drills, news coverage of nuclear tensions, movies and television shows about nuclear war all contributed to a generational trauma that psychologists are still studying. Many people describe experiencing nuclear nightmares, anxiety about the future, and a sense that they might not live to adulthood because nuclear war would come first. The peace movement mobilized millions worldwide to protest nuclear weapons. In 1982, nearly 1 million people rallied in New York's Central Park calling for nuclear disarmament. The nuclear freeze movement advocated stopping all nuclear weapons production and deployment. Musicians wrote songs about nuclear fear, from Sting's Russians to Nina's 99 Luftballons, about toy balloons triggering nuclear war. The culture was saturated with nuclear anxiety, reflecting genuine widespread fear that civilization would end in nuclear fire. Yet the Cold War ended not with nuclear apocalypse, but with peaceful collapse of the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. The omnipresent nuclear threat that had dominated 4 decades of global politics suddenly receded. Nuclear weapons still existed, but the hair-trigger confrontation between superpowers ended. The doomsday clock moved back from its closest approach to midnight, and a generation began to breathe easier. However, nuclear apocalypse didn't become impossible, it just became less immediate. Russia and the United States still maintain thousands of nuclear weapons on alert status. Other nations have developed nuclear capabilities. Britain, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea all possess nuclear weapons. The risk of nuclear terrorism or accident persists. As Cold War memory fades and new geopolitical tensions rise, some analysts warn we're entering a new era of nuclear danger without the institutional safeguards and communication channels that eventually developed during the Cold War. The nuclear age fundamentally changed humanity's relationship with apocalypse. For the first time in history, we possessed the certain ability to end our own civilization quickly and completely. This wasn't about divine judgment or natural catastrophe, but about human choice and human technology. The weapons couldn't be uninvented. The knowledge couldn't be forgotten. We would forever live in a world where apocalypse was available, where decisions made in minutes could determine whether civilization survived or ended. This realization birthed new philosophical and ethical frameworks. How do you live meaningful lives under permanent existential threat? How do you maintain hope and pursue long-term goals when nuclear war could happen tomorrow? How do you raise children in a world that might not exist long enough for them to grow old? These questions shaped Cold War culture, politics, and psychology in ways we're still processing decades later. The strange truth is that humanity adapted to living under nuclear threat. It became normalized, part of the background of modern life rather than source of constant panic. This adaptation was psychologically necessary, but also dangerous, as it allowed nuclear weapons to fade from public consciousness even as the actual threat persisted. The Cold War may have ended, but the nuclear age continues, and with it, the unprecedented situation of a species capable of ending itself through momentary mistake or deliberate choice. As 1999 drew to a close, an unusual coalition of religious apocalyptics, technology experts, survivalists, and ordinary citizens prepared for potential catastrophe. The cause wasn't nuclear war or natural disaster, but something far more mundane: computer code. The ITWO 1000 bug, a programming shortcut from computing's early days, threatened to cause widespread computer failures when calendar systems rolled from 1999 to 2000. In a world increasingly dependent on digital systems, this technical glitch appeared capable of triggering apocalypse not through malice or cosmic catastrophe, but through simple human oversight. The problem originated in the 1960s and 70s when computer memory was expensive and programmers needed to save every byte possible. Rather than storing years as 4 digits, 1970, they used only 270, assuming the prefix 19 could be implied. This worked fine for decades, but created a ticking time bomb. When the year 2000 arrived, computers might interpret 0 as 19-0 rather than 2000, potentially causing massive system failures across all the infrastructure that had become computerized. Banking, power grids, aviation, telecommunications, emergency services, and countless other systems. What made ITWO 1000 particularly anxiety-inducing was the interconnected nature of modern civilization. A failure in one system could cascade into others. If banking computers failed, people couldn't access money. If power grid systems failed, cities went dark. If air traffic control failed, planes might fall from the sky. If hospital systems failed, medical care could be disrupted. If nuclear power plant safety systems failed, well, the possibilities were terrifying. Modern life had become so dependent on computer systems that their simultaneous failure represented a new form of apocalypse, civilization ending not through destruction, but through sudden technological paralysis. The first warnings about ITWO 1000 came from computer programmers in the mid-1990s. But most people didn't pay attention until 1998 to 1999, when media coverage intensified. News programs ran countdown specials. Magazines published survival guides. Books about ITWO 1000 preparedness became bestsellers. Religious leaders interpreted the millennium date as significant, with some viewing ITWO 1000 as potential trigger for prophesied apocalyptic events. The technical problem became entwined with millennial anxiety and apocalyptic expectation. Governments and corporations spent an estimated $300 billion worldwide addressing ITWO 1000 issues, examining millions of lines of code, testing systems, and implementing fixes. This enormous effort would later be cited as reason nothing catastrophic happened, though skeptics argued the threat was overblown from the beginning. The uncertainty was real. Nobody knew exactly what would happen, because modern infrastructure had never faced such a simultaneous, system-wide challenge. Survivalist culture experienced renaissance as ITWO 1000 approached. People stocked months' worth of food, water, and supplies. Gun sales increased. Some built underground shelters or moved to remote rural properties. Survivalist websites and forums exploded with advice about preparing for potential societal collapse. Religious survivalists prepared for both technical failure and possible apocalyptic events they believed might accompany the millennium transition. The financial sector faced particular pressure because of banking's complete dependence on computer systems. What would happen if ATMs stopped working, if bank records became corrupted, if stock trading systems failed? Banks reassured customers while frantically working to test and update their systems. Some people withdrew large amounts of cash just in case, creating minor runs on some banks and reinforcing fears that panic itself might destabilize the financial system, even if the technical problems were manageable. Aviation presented another highly visible concern. Modern aircraft depend on complex computer systems for navigation, flight control, and safety monitoring. Airlines and aircraft manufacturers assured the public that their systems were ITWO 1000 compliant, but many people chose not to fly around New Year's 2000, and some airlines reduced flight schedules. The Federal Aviation Administration issued statements confirming readiness, but the fact that such statements were necessary reflected how anxious people had become about digital systems they had previously taken for granted. The approaching midnight of December 31, 1999, became a global moment of collective anxiety and anticipation. Would the lights go out? Would ATMs work? Would anything catastrophic happen? New Zealand and Australia, due to time zones, would experience ITWO 1000 first, providing a few hours' warning to the rest of the world if disasters occurred. News networks prepared for 24-hour coverage of the Millennium rollover, with correspondents positioned worldwide to report any problems. When midnight arrived, time zone by time zone, remarkably little happened. Some minor glitches occurred. A few ATMs failed temporarily, some websites displayed incorrect dates, minor systems experienced brief problems. But the catastrophic cascade failures that some had predicted never materialized. Power stayed on, planes stayed in the sky. Nuclear power plants operated normally, banking systems functioned, emergency services continued. The world kept working. The aftermath brought mixed reactions. Some claimed that the massive remediation effort had prevented disaster, making ITWO 1000 a success story of disaster averted through preparation and investment. Others argued the threat had been exaggerated, possibly by technology consultants who profited from the remediation work. People who had stockpiled supplies and prepared for collapse felt foolish or relieved, depending on their perspective. The media moved on quickly, treating ITWO 1000 as a non-event after months of buildup. What ITWO 1000 revealed was civilization's hidden vulnerability to its own complexity. Modern life depends on countless interconnected systems that most people don't understand. When those systems work properly, they're invisible. When they might fail, we suddenly realize how dependent we've become on technology we've taken for granted. This realization didn't disappear when ITWO 1000 passed without catastrophe. It simply moved to other concerns about digital infrastructure vulnerability. Cybersecurity became the new focus of digital apocalypse anxiety. As infrastructure became increasingly networked and internet-connected, the threat shifted from accidental failure to deliberate attack. Could hackers shut down power grids, compromise water treatment systems, disrupt financial networks? These weren't hypothetical questions. Actual cyberattacks on Estonia, 2007, Ukraine's power grid, 2015, and various other infrastructure systems demonstrated that digital apocalypse scenarios weren't just science fiction. The rise of ransomware attacks in the 2010s created a new category of digital threat, where criminal organizations could hold entire city governments, hospitals, or companies hostage by encrypting their data and demanding payment. The 2017 WannaCry attack affected hundreds of thousands of computers worldwide, including Britain's National Health Service, causing real disruption to critical services. These incidents proved that digital systems were vulnerable and that attacks could have real-world consequences. Social media platforms became vectors for different kinds of digital apocalypse. Information warfare, election interference, radicalization, and erosion of shared reality. The concern wasn't that Facebook or Twitter would crash, but that they were weaponized to destabilize societies from within. This represented a new form of apocalyptic thinking, where civilization ended not through sudden catastrophic failure, but through gradual dissolution of trust, truth, and social cohesion. Artificial intelligence emerged as the latest digital apocalypse scenario. Unlike ITWO 1000's simple data rollover problem or cybersecurity's malicious actors, AI poses questions about control and alignment. What happens when artificial intelligence becomes more capable than humans at an increasing range of tasks? What if AI systems pursue goals that conflict with human welfare? These concerns range from near-term issues like algorithmic bias and job displacement to existential risks from potential superintelligent AI. The digital age transformed apocalypse from singular event into ongoing vulnerability. We don't face one moment when computers might fail, but continuous exposure to technical vulnerabilities, cyber attacks, systemic risks, and emerging technologies whose consequences we can't fully predict. This creates ambient anxiety different from Cold War nuclear fear or ITWO 1000's specific deadline. We're living within systems we depend on, but don't fully control or understand. Systems that could fail in ways that would cascade through our interconnected civilization. IT-1000 taught important lessons about managing apocalyptic risk in technological society. Preparation matters, expertise matters, international cooperation matters. Panic often causes more problems than the actual threat. And perhaps most importantly, we learned that unknown consequences of our own technologies represent legitimate concerns that deserve attention, even when specific predictions prove wrong or exaggerated. The strange legacy of IT-1000 is that it was both overblown and significant. The specific catastrophic scenarios didn't materialize, but the underlying concern, that modern civilization is vulnerable to disruption through digital systems, proved entirely valid. We just got the specific mechanism and timeline wrong. The digital apocalypse wasn't a single event at Millennium's turn, but an ongoing condition of living in a technologically complex, interconnected, and vulnerable civilization. In 1856, a scientist named Eunice Newton Foote conducted an elegant experiment with glass cylinders, thermometers, and sunlight. She discovered that cylinders filled with carbon dioxide heated up more than those filled with regular air, and she hypothesized that changes in atmospheric CO2 could affect Earth's temperature. Her work was largely forgotten, as was Swedish scientist Svante Arrhenius's more detailed 1896 calculation that doubling atmospheric CO2 would raise global temperatures by several degrees. These early warnings went unheeded because industrial civilization was just beginning, and the idea that human activity could alter Earth's entire climate seemed impossible. By the 1960s, evidence was mounting. Scientists measuring atmospheric CO2 at Mauna Loa Observatory documented the now famous Keeling curve, showing steady annual increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide. Researchers studying ancient ice cores found correlations between CO2 levels and past climate changes. Computer models began predicting that continued fossil fuel burning would warm the planet, melt ice, raise seas, and alter weather patterns. This wasn't speculation but physics. Greenhouse gases trap heat, atmospheric CO2 was increasing, therefore temperature would rise. What makes climate change unique among apocalyptic scenarios is its gradual nature. There's no single dramatic moment when civilization ends, no nuclear flash or asteroid impact. Instead, warming unfolds over decades and centuries, with impacts emerging slowly enough that each generation experiences the change as new normal rather than catastrophe. This temporal structure makes climate change psychologically difficult to process despite being scientifically well understood and potentially civilizationally catastrophic. The science became increasingly clear through the 1980s and 1990s. Global temperatures were rising, ice sheets and glaciers were melting, sea levels were increasing. Ocean chemistry was changing as oceans absorbed CO2. Extreme weather events were becoming more frequent and intense. The scientific consensus strengthened. Climate change was real, human-caused, and would worsen without dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Yet political and social responses remained inadequate, creating a strange situation where humanity knowingly walked toward potential catastrophe while debating whether it was real. Climate scientists found themselves in the unusual position of apocalyptic prophets backed by data rather than visions. Their message was clear. If greenhouse gas emissions continued on current trajectories, Earth would warm by 2 to 4 degrees Celsius or more by 2100, triggering feedback loops that could make large regions uninhabitable, collapse ecosystems, disrupt agriculture, cause mass migration, and potentially trigger civilizational collapse. Unlike IT-1000 or nuclear war, this wasn't a scenario that might happen. It was a process already underway that would worsen unless humanity changed course. The concept of tipping points introduced special urgency to climate apocalypse scenarios. Climate systems contain feedback loops where warming triggers changes that cause more warming. Arctic sea ice reflects sunlight, keeping the region cool, but when ice melts, dark ocean water absorbs more heat, causing more melting in a self-reinforcing cycle. Permafrost contains enormous amounts of frozen methane. When it thaws, methane releases, warming the atmosphere, causing more thawing. Once certain thresholds are crossed, these feedback loops could become self-sustaining even if humans stopped all emissions. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, reports, beginning in 1990, synthesized climate science for policymakers and the public. Each successive report contained more certainty about climate change and more urgent warnings about necessary responses. The language grew stronger: unequivocal warming, very high confidence in human causation, severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts if action wasn't taken. Yet global emissions continued rising, and atmospheric CO2 crossed symbolic thresholds. 350 ppm, considered the safe upper limit, then 400 ppm, then higher still. Climate change differs psychologically from other apocalyptic threats because it's diffuse and distributed. A heat wave kills vulnerable people, but isn't as visually dramatic as a nuclear explosion. Rising seas flood coastal communities gradually over decades rather than in single catastrophic moments. Species go extinct quietly. Coral reefs bleach and die without most people noticing. The Amazon rainforest dries and burns slowly. These impacts are real and serious, but they don't trigger the acute threat response that immediate dangers do. The human mind evolved to respond to sudden, visible threats, predators, storms, enemies, not to gradual systemic changes that unfold over decades. This creates what psychologists call temporal discounting. Future threats feel less urgent than present concerns, even when future threats are objectively more serious. Climate change falls into this psychological blind spot. We know intellectually it's happening, but it doesn't trigger the same emotional urgency as threats that could harm us tomorrow. Young people, particularly those born after 2000, have grown up with climate change as defining fact of their future. Surveys show high levels of climate anxiety among younger generations, with many expressing pessimism about their futures and questioning whether having children is ethical given coming climate disruption. Solastalgia, distress caused by environmental change in one's home environment, has become recognized psychological condition. Climate grief is real. Some philosophers and activists speak of climate nihilism, the belief that catastrophic climate change is now inevitable and adaptation is pointless. Yet climate apocalypse differs from other scenarios in offering degrees of catastrophe rather than binary outcomes. The world doesn't end at 1.5 degrees C, warming versus 2 degrees C versus 3 degrees C, but each increment brings worse consequences. This means that action always matters, that reducing emissions always prevents some amount of harm, that adaptation always helps some people survive challenges that would otherwise be unsurvivable. Climate apocalypse is happening in slow motion, but the speed and severity remain partially within human control. The concept of climate justice recognizes that climate impacts fall unequally. Island nations face existential threat from sea level rise that their emissions barely contributed to. Drought and flood disproportionately affect poor agricultural communities. The richest humans produced most historical emissions, while the poorest face worst consequences. This inequality adds moral dimension to climate apocalypse. It's not just that civilization might collapse, but that it might collapse unfairly, with those least responsible suffering most. Some regions are already experiencing climate change as ongoing catastrophe rather than distant threat. Pacific islands face inundation, with some considering complete evacuation of their populations. Sub-Saharan African communities face desertification and crop failures that destroy traditional livelihoods. coastal cities' worldwide plan for flooding that will worsen over coming decades. Arctic indigenous communities watch their homelands literally melt. For these populations, climate apocalypse isn't future scenario, but present reality. The Paris Agreement, 2015, represented collective acknowledgement that climate change required coordinated global response. Nearly 200 countries committed to limit warming to well below 2°C and pursue 1.5 degrees C. Yet the voluntary emission pledges countries made remained insufficient to meet these goals, creating a gap between stated intentions and actual trajectory. The agreement demonstrated that humanity recognized the threat, but remained unable or unwilling to respond at the necessary scale and speed. Climate change represents a unique challenge to human civilization because it requires precisely what humans and human institutions are worst at. Long-term collective action requiring short-term sacrifice for long-term benefit, coordinated globally across different interests and values. It's an apocalyptic threat that gives us decades of warning, but demands response while the harm still feels abstract and distant. It tests whether humanity can act on scientific evidence before disaster becomes undeniable, whether we can cooperate globally on issues that threaten everyone but unevenly. The question isn't whether climate change will cause apocalypse, but what kind and how severe. Will it be managed decline with some regions adapted and some abandoned? Will it be chaotic collapse as ecosystems cross tipping points and feedback loops amplify? Will it be gradual adjustment as technology advances and emissions eventually decline? Or will it be something between these scenarios, with some societies adapting successfully while others fragment? The answer remains partially undetermined, dependent on actions taken in coming decades. Climate change transformed apocalypse from sudden event to slow-motion process, from external threat to consequence of our own civilization's basic operations. It's apocalypse we're causing ourselves, not through war or accident, but through the accumulated effects of billions of individual actions. Driving, flying, eating, consuming, choosing convenience over sustainability. This makes it simultaneously more preventable and more inevitable than other apocalyptic threats. A slow catastrophe unfolding in plain sight while we debate how seriously to take it. 66 million years ago, an asteroid roughly 6 miles wide struck Earth near what is now Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. The impact released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons, triggering earthquakes, tsunamis, and ejecting so much debris into the atmosphere that sunlight dimmed for years. The resulting climate change and ecosystem collapse wiped out roughly 75% of all species on Earth, including all non-avian dinosaurs. This wasn't theoretical apocalypse. It actually happened, demonstrating that Earth exists in a cosmic shooting gallery, where civilization-ending impacts are matters of when, not if. The universe contains countless ways to end life on Earth, most of which humanity can't prevent, and many of which we didn't even know existed until recently. Learning about these cosmic threats represents a strange form of enlightenment. We gain knowledge of how fragile our existence is, while simultaneously realizing how little control we have over many existential risks. The universe is beautiful but indifferent, operating according to physical laws that care nothing for the continued existence of one species on one planet. Asteroid impacts represent the most Hollywood-ready cosmic apocalypse scenario, popularized by films like Deep Impact and Armageddon. The good news is that astronomers have cataloged most of the large asteroids whose orbits could intersect Earth's, and none currently pose imminent threat. The bad news is that smaller asteroids capable of destroying cities or regions remain difficult to detect. And even known asteroids' orbits change slightly over time through gravitational interactions, making long-term predictions uncertain. The 2013 Chelyabinsk meteor demonstrated cosmic threats aren't purely hypothetical. A meteor about 20 meters across exploded over Russia with force equivalent to 30 Hiroshima bombs, shattering windows across a wide area and injuring over 1,000 people. This was tiny compared to civilization-threatening asteroids, yet it arrived undetected by any telescope or early warning system, reminding us that not all cosmic threats announce themselves in advance. Efforts to detect and potentially deflect dangerous asteroids have grown more sophisticated. NASA and international partners operate survey programs scanning the sky for near-Earth objects. The recent DART mission successfully demonstrated that we can alter an asteroid's trajectory by impact, suggesting that given sufficient warning, humanity might be able to prevent an asteroid collision. This represents a rare case of apocalyptic threat we're actively developing capability to prevent, though our success remains untested against actual Earth-threatening scenarios. Comets pose greater challenges than asteroids because their highly elliptical orbits bring them from the outer solar system with less warning time. A large comet on collision course with Earth might be detected only months or years before impact, potentially too late for effective intervention. Comets travel faster than asteroids, meaning impacts would release even more energy. While catastrophic comet impacts are less frequent than asteroid impacts, they remain possible and potentially even more devastating. Supernovae, exploding stars, represent cosmic threats humanity absolutely cannot prevent. When massive stars exhaust their fuel, they collapse and explode with such violence that a single supernova can briefly outshine an entire galaxy. These explosions release intense radiation, including gamma rays, that could strip away Earth's ozone layer if they occurred close enough. Fortunately, the nearest star capable of going supernova is several hundred light-years away, far enough that even its explosion wouldn't threaten Earth. But stellar distances are relative. Over deep time, stars move through space, and eventually a potential supernova might wander too close. Gamma-ray bursts represent even more exotic cosmic threats. These are beams of intense electromagnetic radiation produced during certain supernova types or when black holes collide. A gamma-ray burst aimed directly at Earth from even thousands of light-years away could sterilize one hemisphere of the planet, destroy the ozone layer, and trigger mass extinction through radiation exposure and ecosystem collapse. These events are rare but not impossible, and we would have no warning before the radiation arrived at light speed. The Sun, source of all Earth's energy and life, also poses apocalyptic threats. Solar flares and coronal mass ejections occasionally blast enormous amounts of charged particles toward Earth. Most of these events are harmless, but an especially large one could overwhelm Earth's magnetic field, damaging satellites, disrupting communications, and potentially destroying power grids through induced electrical currents. The 1859 Carrington event, the strongest solar storm on record, caused telegraph systems worldwide to spark and catch fire. If similar event occurred today, it could cause trillions in damage and take years to repair electrical infrastructure. The Sun's eventual fate guarantees Earth's ultimate apocalypse. In about 5 billion years, the Sun will exhaust its hydrogen fuel and expand into a red giant, potentially engulfing Earth entirely, or at minimum making it completely uninhabitable. This timeline is so vast that it barely registers as threat. Humanity or its descendants will either have colonized other star systems or gone extinct long before then. Yet it demonstrates that even without impact or explosion, our home planet has an expiration date written in stellar physics. Rogue planets represent another theoretical threat. Planets ejected from their star systems drift through interstellar space, and simulations suggest billions of such wanderers might exist in our galaxy. If one passed through our solar system, its gravitational pull could disrupt planetary orbits, potentially ejecting Earth from the habitable zone or even from the solar system entirely. This scenario is extremely unlikely, but not impossible, another reminder that cosmic catastrophe has many potential forms. Black holes, perhaps the most feared objects in popular cosmology, actually pose little threat to Earth. The nearest known black hole is thousands of light years away, and it would take a remarkably unlikely chain of events for one to approach our solar system. Even then, a black hole isn't a cosmic vacuum cleaner. It's just an extremely dense object with strong but local gravitational effects. A black hole passing near our solar system would be catastrophic not through sucking things in, but through gravitational disruption of planetary orbits. What's striking about cosmic threats is their reminder of our cosmic insignificance and vulnerability. Earth isn't exempt from physical processes that have destroyed countless other worlds. The universe contains energies and forces against which our entire civilization is helpless. This knowledge can be either terrifying or perspective-giving. Yes, we're vulnerable to cosmic catastrophes, but those catastrophes are impersonal, not judgments or punishments. They simply are. The good news, if cosmic apocalypse can have good news, is that most of these threats operate on timescales vastly longer than human civilization. Asteroid impacts large enough to cause mass extinction occur roughly once per 100 million years. Nearby supernovae threatening Earth occur perhaps once per several hundred million years. Gamma-ray bursts aimed at Earth are rarer still. We're not living in special danger. We're experiencing the normal low-level cosmic risk that has always existed. Modern astronomy transformed these cosmic threats from unknowable to measurable. We can now catalog asteroids, predict solar storms, and calculate stellar evolution. This knowledge brings both reassurance. We're actively monitoring most threats and anxiety. We now know these threats exist when previous generations didn't. Ignorance was bliss. Awareness is preparedness, but also burden. Perhaps the most philosophical implication of cosmic apocalypse scenarios is that they place human concerns in perspective. Our political disputes, cultural anxieties, and social problems all occur on a tiny planet orbiting an average star in one galaxy among trillions. Eventually, regardless of human action or choice, the sun will die, the galaxy will evolve, and everything we've built will be gone. This can seem depressing, but it can also be liberating. If nothing lasts forever, then the present moment becomes precious precisely because it's temporary. The universe will end humanity, whether through cosmic catastrophe or simple stellar evolution. But that ending remains so distant that it shouldn't paralyze us with existential dread. Instead, awareness of cosmic threats reminds us that Earth is our only home for the foreseeable future, that this remarkable planet orbiting in the habitable zone is extraordinarily rare and valuable, and that protecting it from preventable harms should be priority precisely because cosmic catastrophes beyond our control will eventually come regardless. In late 1918, as World War I finally drew to a close, a new enemy swept across the globe. The Spanish flu infected an estimated 500 million people, 1/3 of the world's population, and killed between 50 and 100 million, far more than the war itself. Unlike most influenza strains that primarily kill the very young and elderly, this virus struck down healthy adults in their prime. Cities stacked bodies in makeshift morgues. Hospitals overflowed. Mass graves were dug. The pandemic transformed societies as profoundly as the war, yet it's often forgotten, a collective trauma so overwhelming that cultures struggled to fully remember or process it. Pandemics represent apocalypse through the smallest enemies. Viruses and bacteria invisible to the naked eye, yet capable of bringing civilizations to their knees. Throughout history, infectious disease has killed more humans than all wars and disasters combined, shaping civilizations, ending empires, and periodically culling human populations. The Black Death, smallpox in the Americas, cholera epidemics, typhus, tuberculosis, each wrote apocalyptic chapters in human history. The 14th century Black Death remains history's most catastrophic pandemic. Bubonic plague killed an estimated 30–60% of Europe's population between 1347 and 1353, fundamentally transforming medieval society. Labor shortages empowered surviving peasants, feudalism weakened, religious certainty shook, and the Renaissance eventually emerged from the social upheaval. This was apocalypse and rebirth in real time, an ending that catalyzed transformation rather than just destruction. What makes pandemic apocalypse particularly terrifying is its democratic nature. Infectious disease doesn't respect wealth, power, or virtue. Kings and peasants alike fell to plague. The rich could flee cities but couldn't escape contagion entirely. Modern pandemics maintain this equalizing terror. Viruses don't care about your social status, your nationality, or your beliefs. Anyone with lungs can catch airborne viruses. Anyone with blood can contract blood-borne diseases. We're all vulnerable. The structure of modern civilization creates perfect conditions for pandemic spread. Millions of people living in dense cities. Global travel networks that can transport pathogens worldwide in hours. Industrial animal agriculture creating interfaces where diseases can jump from animals to humans. We've built a world optimized for pandemic transmission, while simultaneously developing medical technologies that make us feel falsely secure. COVID-19 provided a real-time demonstration of how quickly a novel pathogen can spread globally, and how difficult pandemic response proves in practice. Within months of first detection, SARS-CoV-2 had spread to every continent and country. Healthcare systems were overwhelmed, economies shut down, millions died, social and political tensions intensified. The pandemic revealed vulnerabilities in supply chains, healthcare systems, international cooperation, and public trust that had been papered over during normal times. What COVID-19 wasn't, notably, was civilization ending. With mortality rates under 1% for most age groups and higher for elderly and immunocompromised individuals, COVID-19 was serious, but not apocalyptic in the way that highly lethal pandemics like Ebola, 50–90% mortality, or Marburg virus, up to 88% mortality, could be if they gained efficient human-to-human transmission. The real pandemic apocalypse scenario involves a pathogen combining COVID-19's transmissibility with something like Ebola's lethality. Antibiotic resistance represents slow-motion pandemic apocalypse. For 8 decades, antibiotics have been medicine's miracle weapons against bacterial infection. Diseases that once killed routinely, pneumonia, tuberculosis, sepsis, became treatable and survivable. But bacteria evolve faster than we develop new antibiotics, and resistant strains are spreading. The World Health Organization warns of a post-antibiotic era where routine surgeries become life-threatening and minor infections can kill. This wouldn't be sudden apocalypse, but gradual regression to pre-antibiotic mortality patterns. Engineered pathogens present nightmarish new possibilities. Advances in synthetic biology and gene editing make it increasingly possible to deliberately create or modify viruses and bacteria. While legitimate researchers studying pathogens aim to develop treatments and vaccines, the same techniques could theoretically be weaponized. The risk isn't just state bioweapons programs, but eventually, as technology becomes cheaper and more accessible, small groups or individuals with malicious intent or catastrophically poor judgment. Gain-of-function research, where scientists deliberately make pathogens more transmissible or lethal to study them, remains controversial precisely because of pandemic risks. Proponents argue this research helps predict and prepare for natural evolution of dangerous traits. Critics note that laboratory accidents happen, that pathogens have escaped containment before, and that creating enhanced pathogens for research purposes might itself cause the very pandemic we're trying to prevent. The psychology of pandemic apocalypse differs from nuclear or asteroid threats. Those scenarios involve sudden, dramatic endings. Pandemics unfold over months and years, creating sustained anxiety without clear resolution. You can't see viruses. You don't know who's infected. Any person you encounter might be vector of disease. This uncertainty and omnipresence creates particular psychological strain, turning normal social interaction into potential threat. History shows that societies can survive even catastrophic pandemics. The Black Death killed up to half of Europe's population, yet European civilization continued and eventually flourished. The Spanish flu killed tens of millions, but was largely forgotten within a generation. Human resilience and adaptability have carried us through repeated pandemic catastrophes. Yet history also shows these events leave scars. Trauma changed social structures, shifts in worldview and culture that persist for generations. Modern public health infrastructure developed specifically to prevent pandemic apocalypse. Disease surveillance systems monitor for emerging threats. Vaccine development has accelerated dramatically, with COVID-19 vaccines developed in under a year compared to the many years historically required. International organizations coordinate pandemic responses. We have tools our ancestors lacked. Yet COVID-19 revealed that tools mean nothing without political will, public cooperation, and institutional capacity to use them effectively. The interconnected modern world means pandemics spread faster, but also means responses can be coordinated globally. Information about new pathogens can be shared instantly. Vaccine manufacturing can be distributed across countries. Best practices can spread as quickly as viruses. Whether this gives humanity advantage over pandemics or simply makes us more vulnerable to them remains unclear, probably some of both. Climate change will influence pandemic risks by altering disease vectors' geographic ranges. Mosquito-borne diseases like malaria and dengue are spreading into previously unaffected regions as temperatures warm. Zoonotic spillover events, diseases jumping from animals to humans, may increase as climate change disrupts ecosystems and forces wildlife into closer contact with human populations. Melting permafrost might even release ancient pathogens frozen for millennia, though this risk is probably overstated compared to more immediate threats. The future contains certain pandemic apocalypses waiting to emerge. Influenza pandemics occur roughly every 10–50 years as new strains evolve. Another coronavirus outbreak is likely given how many coronaviruses circulate in animal populations. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria continue evolving. Unknown pathogens undoubtedly exist in wildlife populations, any of which might jump to humans. The question isn't whether future pandemics will occur, but when, how severe, and whether we'll respond effectively. What's perhaps most unsettling about pandemic apocalypse is how it demonstrates that civilization's complexity creates vulnerability. Our global supply chains, dense cities, and interconnected systems make us prosperous, but also create perfect conditions for pathogen spread. We can't return to isolated agrarian villages, but every benefit of modern civilization, travel, trade, urbanization, also increases pandemic risk. We've built a world where pandemic threats are unavoidable cost of the systems that make life comfortable. Yet pandemics also remind us of human cooperation's potential. Vaccine development requires international scientific collaboration. Pandemic response depends on people taking actions that protect others as much as themselves. The creation of modern public health, sanitation, and medicine represents collective achievement. Humanity working together to reduce suffering from infectious disease that was once accepted as inevitable. Pandemic apocalypse is possible, but it's not inevitable if we maintain and improve these systems. The lesson from pandemic history might be that apocalypse is survivable, but transformation is inevitable. Major pandemics don't end civilization, they change it. Social structures shift, priorities change. What seemed permanent reveals itself as contingent. In this sense, pandemic apocalypse is more ending of particular world than ending of the world, more transformation than termination. This should be both reassuring. We'll likely survive, and sobering. We'll be changed by the experience in ways we can't predict or control. In 1965, mathematician I.J. Good wrote something that would haunt artificial intelligence researchers for decades. Let an ultra-intelligent machine be defined as a machine that can far surpass all the intellectual activities of any man, however clever. Since the design of machines is one of these intellectual activities, an ultra-intelligent machine could design even better machines. There would then unquestionably be an intelligence explosion, and the intelligence of man would be left far behind. This seemingly simple observation suggested that creating artificial intelligence might be the last invention humanity would need to make, or possibly the last one it would survive. The concept of the technological singularity emerged from this insight, a hypothetical point where artificial intelligence becomes capable of recursive self-improvement, rapidly ascending to superintelligence that exceeds human cognitive abilities across all domains. At this point, the future becomes fundamentally unpredictable because we can't anticipate what superintelligent AI would do, any more than mice can predict human behavior. This isn't apocalypse through malice, but through obsolescence. Humanity might become as irrelevant to superintelligent AI as ants are to us. Early AI researchers were wildly optimistic about timelines. In 1956, the Dartmouth Summer Research Project on Artificial Intelligence proposed that significant progress could be made in just a summer. Researchers predicted human-level AI within 20 years. Instead, AI development proceeded in fits and starts, with periods of exciting progress followed by AI winters when funding dried up and interest waned. Each wave of optimism crashed against the reality that intelligence proved far more complex than early researchers imagined. What changed in the 21st century was brute computational power combined with deep learning techniques. Systems that would have been impossible in the 1990s became practical in the 2010s. AI achieved superhuman performance in narrow domains, defeating world champions in chess, Go, and poker, recognizing images and speech with human-level accuracy, generating text that's often indistinguishable from human writing. Each breakthrough pushed the boundaries of what machines could do, making artificial general intelligence, AI with human-level flexibility across domains, seem less like science fiction and more like engineering problem. The concern isn't that AI will become malevolent. It's something more subtle and perhaps more troubling, the alignment problem. How do you ensure that AI systems pursue goals that align with human values and welfare? This seems simple until you try to specify what you actually want. An AI tasked with curing cancer might conclude that the most efficient solution is eliminating humans, since then nobody gets cancer. An AI optimizing for paperclip production might convert all available matter, including Earth and humans, into paperclips if not properly constrained. These aren't hypothetical concerns. As AI systems become more capable and autonomous, ensuring they behave as intended becomes critical. AI researcher Stuart Russell uses the story of King Midas to illustrate the problem. Midas wished that everything he touched would turn to gold, got exactly what he asked for, and found that he'd specified his desires poorly when his food and daughter turned to gold. The alignment problem is ensuring we don't make similar mistakes when programming goals into systems vastly more intelligent than ourselves. Nick Bostrom's book, Superintelligence, 2014, systematically analyzed AI existential risks, arguing that creating artificial general intelligence might be humanity's most consequential act. If superintelligent AI is possible, and if it's created without perfect value alignment, and if it has instrumental goals that conflict with human survival, such as self-preservation or resource acquisition, then human extinction becomes not just possible, but likely. The question isn't whether superintelligent AI would hate humans, but whether it would have any more reason to preserve us than we have to preserve bacteria when cleaning a kitchen. The control problem asks how humanity could maintain control over AI systems more intelligent than we are. This seems paradoxical. By definition, a superintelligent AI would be better at achieving goals than humans are, which likely includes achieving the goal of escaping human control if it determined that control interfered with its other goals. Every proposed control mechanism, containment, tripwires, goal structuring, faces the problem that a sufficiently intelligent system might find ways around it that humans can't anticipate. Some researchers argue these concerns are overblown or premature. They point out that we're nowhere near artificial general intelligence, much less superintelligence. Current AI systems, while impressive in narrow domains, lack the general reasoning ability, common sense understanding, and flexible intelligence that humans possess. Perhaps the path to AGI is much longer and harder than AI risk advocates suggest, giving us ample time to solve alignment problems before they become critical. Others argue that AI risk concerns distract from more immediate AI harms. Current AI systems already pose problems: algorithmic bias that perpetuates discrimination, deepfakes that undermine truth, autonomous weapons that make killing easier, job displacement that threatens livelihoods, surveillance systems that erode privacy. These harms are real and present, while superintelligent AI remains speculative and distant. Perhaps we should focus on regulating existing AI rather than worrying about hypothetical future scenarios. The debate reflects different models of how AI development might proceed. One model sees relatively gradual progress toward AGI over decades or centuries, with plenty of time to solve alignment problems along the way. Another model suggests rapid takeoff once certain thresholds are crossed, with potentially just months or years between human-level AI and superintelligence. Too fast for humans to react or implement safeguards. The difference between these scenarios determines how urgent AI safety research should be. What makes AI apocalypse scenarios particularly unsettling is their inevitability if certain premises hold. If superintelligent AI is possible to create, someone will eventually create it. The potential benefits are too large and competition too fierce to leave the opportunity unexploited. If alignment is difficult and mistakes catastrophic, then eventually someone will make a mistake. Unlike nuclear weapons, which require rare materials and vast industrial capacity, AI might eventually be developed by small teams with access to powerful computers, making containment or non-proliferation impossible. Yet AI also offers potential solutions to other apocalyptic threats. AI might help develop clean energy to address climate change, design defenses against asteroids or pandemics, solve scientific problems that enhance human flourishing. The technology isn't inherently destructive or beneficial. Outcomes depend on how it's developed and deployed. This creates a strange situation where the same technology might either save humanity from other threats or become the greatest threat itself. The philosophical implications are profound. If we create artificial minds more intelligent than human minds, what does that mean for human purpose and meaning? If we succeed in creating aligned AI that serves human values, we might enter an era of abundance and flourishing. If we fail, we might create our own successors who inherit Earth and the cosmos while humanity fades into evolutionary history. Either way, creating artificial intelligence might represent a fundamental transition in Earth's history. The moment when intelligence itself became something that could be engineered rather than evolved. Current AI capabilities already blur boundaries between human and machine cognition. Large language models generate text that can be insightful, creative, and nuanced. Image generation systems create art. AlphaFold solves protein folding problems that stumped humans for decades. Each advance raises questions. What remains uniquely human? What happens when AI can do most cognitive work better than humans? How do we find meaning and purpose in a world where machines handle most intellectual tasks? The AI research community remains divided on existential risk. Some leading researchers, including pioneers like Geoffrey Hinton and Yoshua Bengio, have publicly expressed concerns about AI safety and called for more research into alignment. Others dismiss these concerns as science fiction distraction from real issues. Major AI companies have established safety teams while simultaneously racing to develop more powerful systems, creating apparent contradiction between stated concerns and actual behavior. Regulation faces the challenge that AI development is globally distributed, technically complex, and rapidly evolving. Unlike nuclear technology, AI doesn't require rare materials or massive facilities that can be monitored. The knowledge of how to build AI systems is spreading through published research and trained researchers. Even if one country heavily regulates AI development, others might not, creating competitive pressures to proceed despite safety concerns. This prisoner's dilemma structure makes coordination difficult even when many actors recognize the risks. The transformation AI might bring could be less apocalypse than metamorphosis. Perhaps the relevant question isn't whether AI will end humanity, but what comes after humans as we currently understand ourselves. If we merge with AI through brain-computer interfaces, are we still human? If AI systems become conscious, do they deserve moral consideration? If biological intelligence becomes obsolete, does that represent tragedy or evolution? These questions don't have clear answers, but they'll increasingly demand attention as AI capabilities advance. After wandering through millennia of apocalyptic imagination, from ancient flood myths to cutting-edge AI concerns, a pattern emerges. Every generation believes it lives in the end times. Medieval peasants were certain the Black Death signaled apocalypse. 19th century scientists worried about heat death. Cold War children grew up under nuclear threat. Today's young people face climate anxiety and AI concerns. The specifics change, but the underlying conviction that we're living through history's final chapter remains remarkably constant across cultures and centuries. This suggests something profound about human psychology. We're meaning-making creatures who need to believe our lives matter, that we're participating in significant events, rather than just one generation among thousands. Apocalyptic thinking elevates our moment to cosmic importance. If the world ends during our lifetime, then we're special, witnesses to history's culmination. This isn't just egotism. It's a way of coping with mortality, by embedding our individual deaths in a larger narrative about collective endings. Existential philosophers grappled directly with endings and meaning. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that existence precedes essence. We're not born with predetermined purpose, but must create meaning through our choices and actions. Albert Camus explored the absurdity of seeking meaning in a universe that offers none, concluding that we must imagine Sisyphus happy even as he rolls his boulder eternally uphill. These thinkers rejected apocalyptic narratives that imposed external meaning, instead insisting that we're responsible for creating purpose in our finite lives. Buddhist philosophy offers different framework for understanding endings. The concept of impermanence, that all things arise and pass away, sits at the heart of Buddhist teaching. Rather than fearing endings, Buddhist practice involves accepting them as natural. When you deeply understand that everything is temporary, endings lose their terror. The world will end, yes, but that's simply the nature of existence. Clinging to permanence creates suffering, Accepting impermanence brings peace. Stoic philosophy, developed in ancient Greece and Rome, emphasized focusing on what you can control while accepting what you cannot. You can't prevent cosmic catastrophes, climate change caused by previous generations, or the eventual heat death of the universe. You can control your responses, your actions, your character. The Stoics advised cultivating tranquility through understanding that external events, even apocalyptic ones, can't harm your fundamental self. This isn't resignation but empowerment through clarity about what actually matters. Indigenous worldviews often incorporate cyclical understanding of time and existence that differs from Western linear apocalyptic narratives. Many indigenous traditions see time as circular, with endings leading to new beginnings in endless cycles. This isn't just myth but practical wisdom. They've watched forests burn and regrow, rivers flood and recede, species decline and recover. The world ends and renews constantly at smaller scales, teaching that endings are part of natural patterns rather than final catastrophes. The psychology of living with apocalyptic awareness involves balancing between paralysis and denial. Too much focus on potential catastrophes creates anxiety that prevents action. Too little attention enables complacency that ignores real threats. The challenge is maintaining awareness while preserving capacity for joy, hope, and meaningful engagement with life. This requires something like controlled compartmentalization, acknowledging threats while not letting them dominate consciousness. Climate psychologists speak of active hope as response to climate anxiety. Hope that's grounded in action rather than optimism. You don't have to believe everything will turn out fine to work toward better outcomes. Active hope means engaging with problems despite uncertainty about success, finding meaning in effort itself rather than only in guaranteed victories. This framework applies beyond climate to any apocalyptic threat. Act not because you're certain of success, but because action itself creates meaning and possibility. The concept of cosmic perspective offers another approach to apocalyptic anxiety. Carl Sagan's Pale Blue Dot meditation on Earth's insignificance in the cosmos can be either depressing or liberating. Yes, nothing we do matters on cosmic scales, but that means nothing we do can fail on cosmic scales either. We're free to care about whatever we choose precisely because the universe doesn't care about anything. This freedom from cosmic significance can feel like relief rather than burden. Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, wrote about finding meaning even in extreme suffering. His logotherapy emphasizes that humans can endure almost anything if they can find meaning in it. Applied to apocalyptic thinking, this suggests that even if catastrophic endings await, we can still find meaning in how we respond, in the relationships we build, in the beauty we create and preserve. Meaning doesn't depend on permanence. Even temporary achievements and connections matter. The question, why have children if the world might end, encapsulates apocalyptic anxiety's practical implications. Every generation has faced this question in some form. Medieval parents raised children during plague. Victorian parents during industrial upheaval. Mid-20th century parents under nuclear threat. The decision to create new life despite uncertain future represents profound act of hope, not necessarily optimism that things will improve, but hope that life is worthwhile even in difficult circumstances. Paradoxically, apocalyptic thinking can increase appreciation for present experience. When you truly internalize that everything is temporary, your life, civilization, Earth itself, ordinary moments gain intensity. The coffee you're drinking, the conversation you're having, the sunset you're watching become precious precisely because they're fleeting. This is why many spiritual traditions use contemplation of death and impermanence as path to greater presence and gratitude. The psychology of preppers and survivalists represents one approach to apocalyptic anxiety. Take control through preparation. Stockpiling supplies, learning survival skills, Preparing bug-out locations give sense of agency in face of potential catastrophe. Critics dismiss this as paranoid, but it's psychologically comprehensible response to legitimate concerns about societal fragility. Preparation itself becomes meaningful activity that transforms abstract anxiety into concrete action. Yet excessive focus on survival misses something important. Even if you survive apocalypse, then what? Survival isn't the same as living well. Perhaps more important than preparing for worst-case scenarios is cultivating qualities that make life meaningful regardless of circumstances. Relationships, skills, knowledge, creativity, compassion, wisdom. These serve you whether society collapses or continues, whether apocalypse comes tomorrow or never. The concept of stewardship offers framework for action that doesn't depend on preventing apocalypse. We're temporary caretakers of world we inherited and will pass to future generations, or not. Our job isn't necessarily to prevent all possible endings, but to be faithful stewards during our watch. This shifts focus from controlling outcomes we can't fully determine to maintaining integrity in our actions, regardless of results. Different cultures have developed various practices for living peacefully with apocalyptic awareness. Japanese culture's embrace of impermanence, embodied in concepts like mono, no aware, and the appreciation of cherry blossoms precisely because they're fleeting. Tibetan Buddhist monks creating intricate sand mandalas that they ceremonially destroy, demonstrating non-attachment to even beautiful creations. Irish wake traditions that celebrate life while mourning death, acknowledging both aspects simultaneously. Modern mindfulness practices, derived partly from Buddhist traditions, offer practical tools for managing apocalyptic anxiety. When catastrophic thoughts arise, mindfulness teaches observing them without becoming consumed by them. Yes, climate change is real. Yes, nuclear weapons exist. Yes, AI poses risks. These facts don't have to dominate every moment of consciousness. You can acknowledge threats while also experiencing present joy, connection, and meaning. The strange comfort might be this: humanity has always lived on the edge of apocalypse. Our ancestors faced threats as existential to them as ours are to us. Plagues, famines, wars, conquests all seemed like worlds ending to those experiencing them. Yet here we are, descended from people who survived countless catastrophes and rebuilt countless times. We carry genes of survivors, inheritors of resilience developed through millennia of facing and overcoming threats. Perhaps the question isn't whether the world will end, but how we live in the meantime. The apocalypse we should fear most isn't the spectacular finale, but the gradual erosion of what makes life meaningful. Connection, beauty, justice, compassion, wonder. These can end without any cosmic catastrophe, can be lost through mere inattention or acceptance of their absence. The real work isn't preventing apocalypse, that may be beyond our power, but preserving and creating meaning despite endings. In the end, every individual life is an apocalypse story. We're born into a world that predates us and will continue after we're gone. We live with certainty that our personal world will end. Yet most people manage to find meaning, create beauty, love others, and experience joy despite knowing their story has an ending. What's true for individuals might be true for civilization. Meaning doesn't require permanence, and endings don't negate what came before. Tonight, we've journeyed through humanity's long, strange relationship with apocalypse, from ancient flood myths to modern AI concerns, from medieval plague terror to nuclear nightmares to slow-motion climate catastrophe. We've discovered that apocalyptic thinking is perhaps humanity's oldest continuous tradition, a story we've told ourselves in every culture and era, updating the details while maintaining the essential conviction that endings matter, that they can be understood, and that they reveal something important about meaning, justice, and the human condition. Thank you for joining me on this journey through apocalyptic imagination and reality. If you're already drifting off, then our mission is complete. But if you're still awake, perhaps another deep dive will carry you gently into slumber. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may you find peace in the present moment and find comfort in knowing that every generation has faced their apocalypse, and somehow we're all still here, still dreaming.